Chinese, live in this arcane, esoteric world where they focus on literary texts and they don't really see what's happening around them. You're hearing that it's a quite different reality. As I say, when you suddenly become sensitized to an issue, all kinds of things, you see it more and more, and all kinds of things make sense. One of the things which alerted me to this issue was an article in the London, one of the British newspapers, which I read online, which said, let me pose the question, if someone were to ask you, which is the second language of the UK? Obviously English is first. Guesses as to the second language in the UK?
Maybe Arabic.
Maybe Arabic. French, German, Spanish. The second language, the second spoken language in the UK is Polish. If you've been to London recently, all that migration from Eastern Europe. If you go to any bread and breakfast, if you go to any restaurant setup, the persons you're interacting with very often are Polish speakers. The second language in the UK is Polish. How do they know that? They collect the data. I realize that when you look at developed countries, UK, Australia, where you look at developing countries, Nepal, Botswana, Sri Lanka, part of the census data focus on languages spoken by the population. We haven't to date focused on that. So it suddenly occurred to me, I live on the east-west corridor. It's a guessing game, it's a counting game. How many Chinese restaurants are there between Tacarigua and St. Joseph and Barataria? We don't know, but we know there are lots. When we spoke to the Chinese embassy, I was amazed to find out that according to the official figures, and official and unofficial, that gap. According to the official figures, there are 7,000 Mandarin speakers in Trinidad and Tobago in our 1.3 million population. And we're not talking there really. And we are not talking there of third generation Trinidadians whose parents came from Cantonese speaking parts of China. We're talking about recent migration trends. The Spanish speakers, you talk to the Venezuelan embassy and of course their figures say one thing and we know the reality is something. And I said, but who knows? Who has that information apart from the national security? And why is that information not better known by the population? Because there are implications. There are implications for schooling, there are implications for everything. So one of the things when we started, trying to bring this project together and understand the phenomenon, we thought of doing a language audit and to be able to do a language map. And what you're doing basically is you're looking to see what are the languages spoken by your population and perhaps where do people live to know, where you have the resources. Generally that is done with primary data from a census. If you have no primary data, we are giving ourselves the very ambitious task of trying to gather some of that data. We know it's a big challenge, it's beyond our small team, but we're trying. So we're trying to gather it for some of the languages which we feel we could at least get a handle around. So we're looking at it for Japanese, we're looking at it for a few languages. We can't do it all, but really what we hope to come out of this project where that is concerned is we're going to make a recommendation to the CSO, to the Ministry of Planning, that the next census should have questions on languages spoken by the population. Because if you remember the census document, are you from, say, China, and then if you are, skip the next set of questions, because that's where it ends. So that's one of the projects we're having. We're doing, you'll see them described, a language audit. Still in the language thing, of course, Spanish speakers. We have a profusion of Spanish speakers around us. At the Center for Language Learning, I was doing a paper about a year ago, 2 years ago, and I simply did a head count. And in my staff, at the time, among the teaching staff, we had something like 18 nationalities. Probably 5 of them were from Spanish-speaking countries, so we have someone from Spain, from Venezuela, from Mexico, from Colombia, from Ecuador on our staff. But my colleague who teaches French is Ghanaian, and we have Germans, and we have Italians, all legally. All legal. Some of them are people who are diaspora children returning home. So for example, one of our German teachers, her father is Trinidadian, her mother is German, and she grew up in Germany and has decided to come now and try her luck. So we thought about a project that would tap into both the reality on the ground and my staff's research interests. So the lecturer in Spanish, for example, is from Spain. Her husband is from Colombia. She has 2 children. I'm giving out her business, but it's public information. She has an adopted child and she has a biological child. The adopted child, he was probably about 18 months. He was under 2. And there is no way in God's earth, he's probably about 6 now. If you didn't know it, would you know that that child is Trinidadian? Is completely fluent in Spanish. And his mother says not only is he completely fluent in Spanish, he speaks a different Spanish to her husband, who is from Colombia, and a different Spanish to his mother, who is from Spain. We have lots of children like that in the population. Yes, illegal migration is an issue, but we have a number of people whose situations have been regularized, who are here. How are we using that resource as a country? How do we tap into that? These are, language learning is a hard thing, we all know that. So if we have some natural bilinguals among us, what are we doing with them? Do we know who they are? Do we know where they are? How can we use them if we don't collect the data? And what tends to happen in language studies, we know, children as they grow up. When they are small, they're speaking Spanish with the mother, it's fine, with the parents at home. When they move into the school system and everybody else is speaking English, you don't want to stand out. You don't want people to know that your mother is from Venezuela and you're eating arepas at home. You're trying to blend. That's how children are. What the research shows is that if these children are not taught by the education system as early as 6 when they begin school, if you don't catch them then, they lose the competence. Once they move into the formal education system, if there is no support for their language learning, they lose the competence. What it means is not that they stop speaking Spanish or understanding, but what happens is their English race is ahead and they develop a far more sophisticated grammar, vocabulary, language in English. They have academic English, they have English they can use in academic contexts. The Spanish remains talking about food and drink and things at home and emotions and stuff. So you have what we call kind of subtractive bilingualism. The Spanish and English don't develop at the same rate, and there are studies done in the US that show actually that in the most acute cases, a child who has that potential to be bilingual can perform worse than your average person who started Spanish at age 12 because they lose it. It's not being promoted, it's not being developed, and they lose that competence. So what we're looking at in that project is the attitudes these children bring to Spanish. How long do they continue to have, you know, a high level of competence? What is their real level of we're going to measure them, you know, in a very clear clinical way and see how good are they at Spanish and what supports their Spanish learning. Is it that the parents be home are saying, listen, you have to maintain your Spanish fluency. You must speak Spanish as well. You must read at a high level in Spanish, okay? We're looking at that in one project. So that's the language audit, that's the bilingual children, families, and how that the tie with the education sector. And then by training and by first love, I'm a teacher of French. I'm a director of a language center with 11 languages, but by training and first love, I'm a teacher of French. I'm very concerned with what is happening in the education sector with French. I know it's been the refrain for 40 years plus that, you know, French is going to come off the syllabus, what's the use of doing French, blah, 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 why bother? But, I mean, French is an international language. There is the whole of West Africa that is French speaking. We can't limit ourselves to the English speaking world. We have Martinique, Guadeloupe, other places in the Caribbean where French is spoken. So it's important to know what is happening in French. It's important to continue to treasure that resource in French. The project which concerns French looks at people who linguistically we define as plurilingual. Plurilingualism is a very interesting concept used by the European Union. It's a very positive concept. What it says is that a plurilingual is someone who has a repertoire of languages. It doesn't talk about being fluent. It doesn't talk about bilingual in the sense we traditionally understand bilingual. It's not about only recognizing people who have a high level of competence. What it simply says is that Vinya is a plurilingual. She speaks English, she has some mastery of Chinese, she has, I'm sure, Spanish somewhere in her background. I'm a plurilingual. My first language is English. I have a high level of fluency in French. I have a good reading comprehension skill and stuff in Spanish. I can say ni hao in Chinese. Okay, so what it is, it's a very positive value. It's looking at people who, because what we know as linguists, what we know as people working in language learning, is that the more languages you learn, the easier it is to learn. You know, you already have a kind of frame of reference to learning a foreign language, and you add to that. So that if you have the skills in foreign languages, you build on it more easily than someone who really does not have that kind of skill. And it's not an intelligence thing, remember, it's just a human thing. Because I know English speakers like to pat themselves on the back and say, everybody speaks English. Everybody who speaks English is 30% of the world's population. That's it. And of that 30%, we know that there are lots of people for whom English is language 4, 5, or 6. Right? You wander into any village in India, in Africa, in wherever, and you know people master 5 and 6 languages. We kind of congratulate ourselves and say everybody speaks English. There are 1.3 billion people in China. 1.3 billion. How many of them are speaking English? I was in Shanghai in August. Shanghai has a population of 23 million. Everybody speaks English? Okay. So, we have the language audit, which looks at languages spoken. We have the project which is looking at Chinese, at Spanish, and looking at the bilingual families. We have a project which is looking at the plurilingual. So what we've done, we've sent out surveys to people who we know have some competence in French to find out if and how they use their French at all in their daily life. One of your colleagues, I can't remember her name, I'm seeing her, came up to me at, it was something we attended at a Chinese embassy function. And I was delighted to know this was a student from quite a while back who was at the Faculty of Social Sciences at the time, but insisted she wanted to keep up her languages. And because of her insistence and a couple of others like her, we actually created a minor in French for non-humanities students. Because had she been a humanities student, she'd have needed to do a number of literature courses. And people like that really wanted language competence, not necessarily wanting to do more work in literature. And she told me that you are doing a lot of exports to Guadeloupe. I was surprised, I didn't know that. She said they have entered the market. They're having a little difficulty with Martinique. You know, Martinique considers itself Paris in the Caribbean. So they have a little bit of a snootiness about them. But her company is trading with Guadeloupe very successfully. And this is someone who did French at UE and at high school a long time ago, and of course is happy to find opportunities for using her language. This morning's project is trading with China, 1.3 billion. Last year I was fortunate to spend a weekend in France, and there was a phenomenon that left me practically speechless. There are these flagship French stores. This particular one is called the Galeries Lafayette. It's a department store. It's high. It covers the spectrum. It's you know, regular department store, but it does have a high-end component. And I was there one day when these busloads of Chinese tourists arrived, and I was just stunned at the phenomenon. Suddenly, in the areas where the Chinese tourists were doing most of their shopping, you saw an influx of Chinese-speaking staff, and these tourists proceeded to buy and buy and buy and buy. And in my mind I am saying, but the Chinese only have one child. Who are they buying for? Are you buying for the whole village? And they bought. 2013 figures show that 70 million Chinese tourists went abroad. And the Chinese do a lot of local tourism. They do a lot of local tourism, okay? But 70 million Chinese tourists went abroad. There's the value of their currency. China, according to Avian, the Chinese do a nice little something and talk about, you know, they're a developing country. And it's true, because there's some unequal development. But we own the #1 economy in the world is China. There are no two ways about it. There are no two ways about it. The #1 economy in the world is China. You have to understand the big picture, the small picture. You have to understand, I always say to my uni students, you are privileged. You are privileged. We educate 100% primary, we educate 100% secondary, but we still haven't got anywhere near in educating tertiary in the population. The people who to whom much is given, understand these things. You have a duty as a patriot to your country to get that message across. You need to get the message across that we have to stop being so monolithic. We can't find ourselves second time in our history dependent on oil and fossil fuels as we were on cane. And where's the cane now? We can't repeat the mistakes of the past. We have to understand that we have to tap into what we have. We have money in Trinidad too. We may not have as much as the Chinese, but we are a very fortunate country. We have people in Trinidad too. We have the human capital. We are very fortunate in that respect. We have to marshal all our assets to think about what it means developmentally. And as I said, as I started becoming sensitized to the issue, I started reading, seeing things in the European sphere, because I read French and I keep track of what is happening in Europe a lot. Europe is a good model for us in terms of developing language policies. And this notion of competitiveness, I kept seeing. And then I had two experiences at conferences, and in one of them, there was a presentation by someone who is an academic, based at a business school, who had linked with colleagues in languages, and they had done a very interesting study trying to measure the UK's capacity for export, comparing that capacity with what happens in the EU. And out of that work, they came up with the notion of a trade tax. Now, I am as dyslexic as they come, especially for numbers. So don't quote me on this, I'm saying it off the top of my head. What they have found in the UK is that the UK pays what they're calling a trade tax of 0.05% of their GDP. They estimate that every year the UK loses approximately 73, I think, billion pounds. You know why? Because they speak English and everybody speaks English and they don't have to bother about everybody else. So what happens? They only go to English-speaking markets, or primarily. They refuse to engage with markets where their interlocutors don't speak English. So Germany is fine, and Finland is fine, and all those places where people have high levels of skills, but they're not trying to sell to the Portuguese, they're not trying to sell to the Turks, they're not trying to sell to other people because they don't have the language skills. So they stick to their safe markets where English can be the language of communication. And they pay for that via a trade tax, which is the gap between what they could export if they explored all the opportunities and what they actually are exporting. What the studies also showed is that if you have people who in the export end of your company who have exposure to languages and who have that sensitivity to cultural issues, they approach the whole task of exporting quite differently. They have a sense of the cultural dimension. They are perhaps, it's not that there will never be miscommunication in a business context, but there's less a tendency to do that because they are a little bit more aware of how people see the world differently, of what works cross-culturally and cross-linguistically. So, in this project, Trading with China, we decided what we do would be to find out how many people were trading with China. So we sent around a survey to people in the business community. What was their experience? How did they manage? How did they negotiate with China? Whether they had in-house staff with facility in Chinese, whether it was important that the person in China spoke English, whether it was only because you were excellent trading Franco's future when you had ancestral ties with China that you were looking to China, kind of what was the dynamic. We tried to gather a set of preliminary data to understand who were the people trading with China and what had been their experience from the linguistic and cultural. We didn't get lots of answers, but we still plugged it up, but it did show us some interesting things. And basically that's what this project is about. The project has several elements, so we are doing the survey to gather data. My colleagues, my Chinese colleagues, have prepared some interesting little multimedia bits for you, which you will see, which they will show you in a little while. We are doing things like an FAQs, what to do and don't do, what is taboo, what is good, what is seen as negative. Those kinds of little cultural things that could help you. But basically what we're trying to do is to build a resource for people who are involved in trade with China, a resource coming out of language and culture that we could help. So we'll have a website. This information is not going to be kept for us. The project umbrella under which it falls is one which is funded by the government called the Research and Development Impact Fund. And it's a kind of a new approach in research in universities where research is no longer something that you're doing to get a promotion. It's no longer something which you're keeping for yourself, but you're looking at how research can have an impact on the people who are supporting you in fine style in your university office. You're looking to see how you can do the kind of research that makes a difference to your society, to your economy. So the fact, for example, that the CSO does not collect data on language groups, that's the kind of impact we want to, so that the next time the census is done, because of the research we have done, because of what we have been able to show, the CSO would hopefully include that as one of the areas in their research. It is because of the work we are doing on China that we hope people will understand that trade with China is important. It's something though that we have to manage. And one of the ways to manage it is by making sure that you have the skills, language and culture to engage with China.